The dawn was meant to be her last. Lady Elspeth Grey stood in the cold stone chamber of the tower, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope, her body wrapped in nothing more than the thin white shift they gave to those condemned to die. Through the narrow slit of window high above, she could see the first pale fingers of morning light reaching across the London sky, and she knew what it meant. In less than an hour, she would be led out to the courtyard where the executioner's block waited, still stained dark from the blood of traitors who had knelt there before her. The crowd would be gathering already, eager and restless, hungry for the spectacle of a noblewoman's fall. She had heard their jeers the day before, when they dragged her through the streets in chains. They called her traitor, spy, conspirator against the crown. They spat at her feet and threw rotten fruit that splattered against her dress. And through it all, Elspeth had kept her head high, her face calm, because she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not beg for a mercy that did not exist. But now, alone in the darkness, with only the rats and the cold for company, she allowed herself to tremble. Not from fear of death itself, but from the bitter injustice of it all. She was innocent. She had committed no crime, whispered no secrets to England's enemies, plotted no harm against the king. And yet here she stood, condemned by lies so carefully woven that even the judges had believed them without question. The truth was far uglier than treason. It was betrayal of the most intimate kind. Her stepmother, the woman who had smiled at her across the breakfast table for 7 years, had orchestrated every detail of Elspeth's destruction. Lady Beatrice Grey needed a scapegoat, someone expendable to take the blame for the real traitor, her own beloved son, Edmund. And Elspeth, the forgotten daughter of a bankrupt earl, the girl with no mother to protect her and no fortune to make her valuable, had been the perfect sacrifice. Beatrice had planted the incriminating letters in Elspeth's chamber. She had coached the servants to give testimony against her. She had wept convincing tears in court, playing the role of the heartbroken stepmother who could not believe such wickedness had been hiding under her roof. The performance had been flawless. And Elspeth, with no allies, no coin for proper defense, and a name that carried no weight in society's grand game, had been swept toward the block like debris in a storm. Even her own father had turned his face away during the trial, too weak and too drunk to stand against his new wife, too broken by debt and shame to fight for his own daughter. Estou muito feliz que você esteja aqui comigo nesta jornada. Se esta história está tocando seu coração, por favor, inscreva-se no canal e deixe seu like. Sua presença aqui significa tudo para mim e quero continuar trazendo histórias que aquecem a alma e nos fazem acreditar no poder do amor verdadeiro. But there was one detail that haunted Elspeth more than all the rest, one name that sent ice through her veins every time she thought of it. Lord Alaric Thornwood, the Duke of Ravenmore. He would be the one to kill her. He was the High Executioner of the realm, a title passed down through his family for generations, a duty he performed with legendary precision and terrifying coldness. They said he never hesitated, never flinched, never showed mercy. They said his heart had frozen solid years ago after some great tragedy, and that he carried out the king's justice like a man performing a business transaction. Nothing more, nothing less. Elspeth had seen him only once during her sentencing, standing at the back of the courtroom like a shadow made flesh. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes like winter storms, he had watched the proceedings with an expression of absolute emptiness. When the judge pronounced her sentence, death by beheading at dawn, Lord Thornwood had simply nodded once and walked away. No emotion, no reaction, just acceptance of another task to complete. And now, as the light grew stronger beyond her window, Elspeth knew he was preparing himself, sharpening his axe, checking the weight and balance, making ready to end her life with a single perfect stroke. She wondered what it would feel like, that final moment. Would she feel the blade? Would there be pain, or would darkness come too quickly? Would she have time for one last thought, one last prayer? Her hands trembled harder, and she pressed them together, trying to find some scrap of courage in the ruins of her hope. She was 23 years old. She had never been loved, never been cherished, never been seen as anything more than an inconvenience by the people who should have protected her. And now she would die alone, unmourned, her name forever blackened by crimes she did not commit. History would remember her as a traitor. No one would ever know the truth. No one would ever care enough to look beyond the convenient lie. The key turned in the lock of her cell door, and Elspeth's heart lurched. It was time. The guards entered, their faces carefully blank, and began to lead her toward the stairs. Her legs felt like water beneath her, but she forced them to move one step and then another, climbing up toward the pale morning light and the waiting crowd and the man with the axe who would deliver her into oblivion. But to understand how Lady Elspeth Grey had arrived at this terrible dawn, one must travel back 18 months, to a different morning in a different season, when her life still held the fragile possibility of something better. It had been autumn then, and Elspeth had been standing in the drawing room of her father's crumbling estate in Derbyshire, her hands folded neatly before her, listening to her stepmother explain the arrangement that would define her future. Lady Beatrice Grey had been all smiles that day, her voice honey-sweet as she outlined the plan. Elspeth would be sent to London to serve as companion to the Dowager Countess of Ashford, an elderly widow who needed a young woman of gentle birth to read to her, manage her correspondence, and provide respectable company. It was a position of service, certainly, but a dignified one, and it would remove Elspeth from the estate where her presence had become, as Beatrice so delicately phrased it, somewhat awkward. After all, with Edmund now of age and beginning to move in society, it would not do to have his penniless stepsister lurking about, a constant reminder of their reduced circumstances. Elspeth had accepted the exile with the same quiet grace she had learned to wear like armor. She had no illusions about her place in the world. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her father devastated and deeply in debt. Within 2 years he had remarried, choosing Beatrice for her small fortune and her willingness to overlook his financial disasters. Beatrice had brought her own son into the household, the golden Edmund, 5 years older than Elspeth, and possessed of all the charm and confidence that money and maternal devotion could provide. From that moment forward, Elspeth had understood that she was the unwanted remainder of her father's first life, tolerated but never treasured, fed and housed but never truly seen. So when the opportunity came to leave, to disappear into service in London, where at least she might be useful to someone, she had packed her few belongings without complaint and boarded the coach that would carry her away from the only home she had ever known. The Dowager Countess had proven to be a kind mistress, demanding but fair, and for nearly a year Elspeth had found a strange sort of peace in her new role. She read novels aloud in the evenings, her voice bringing stories to life for eyes too dim to see the pages. She wrote letters in a neat, elegant hand, managing the correspondence that kept the Dowager connected to society. She poured tea and arranged flowers, and accompanied the old woman on her slow walks through the garden. It was not the life she might have dreamed of as a girl, but it was honest work, and she performed it well. The Dowager even grew fond of her, praising her intelligence and her gentle manner, occasionally hinting that she might remember Elspeth in her will. For the first time in years, Elspeth had felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Perhaps she could build a small future for herself after all, modest but independent, free from the cold indifference of her father's house. But then Edmund had arrived in London for the season, and everything had begun to unravel. He had visited his stepsister at the Dowager's residence, all bright smiles and brotherly affection, and Elspeth had been foolish enough to believe it genuine. He had taken her walking in the park, bought her ices, introduced her to his friends as though she were truly his sister, and not merely an inconvenient connection. And in her loneliness, in her desperate hunger for family, Elspeth had trusted him. She had confided in him about her quiet life, her modest hopes, her gratitude for the Dowager's kindness. She had never suspected that Edmund was studying her, learning her routines, mapping out her movements and her access to the Dowager's household. She had never imagined that he was planning to use her, that he had already made contact with French agents, selling English military secrets for gold that would pay his gambling debts and fund his expensive tastes, that he needed someone to take the fall when the conspiracy was eventually discovered, someone powerless and forgettable, someone whose destruction would cost him nothing at all. His own stepsister, invisible and unloved, was the perfect victim. and Lady Beatrice, ever the devoted mother, had helped him lay the trap with ruthless efficiency. The night they came to arrest her, Elspeth had been reading by candlelight in her small chamber at the Dowager's residence, lost in the pages of a novel about a heroine far braver than she would ever be. The pounding on the door had shattered the quiet like a musket shot, and before she could even rise from her chair, the king's guards had burst into the room with drawn swords and faces hard as stone. They had torn through her belongings with brutal efficiency, and within minutes they had found what they were looking for: letters written in code, hidden beneath the false bottom of her writing desk, correspondence that detailed troop movements and naval positions, secrets that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of government. Elspeth had stared at those letters in complete incomprehension, her mind unable to grasp what she was seeing. She had never laid eyes on them before. She had no idea how they had come to be in her possession. But her denials meant nothing against the physical evidence, and the guards had clapped her in irons and dragged her away while the Dowager wept helplessly in her nightgown, too shocked and frail to do anything but watch her companion being taken. The trial had been swift and merciless. The prosecution had presented a devastating case, built on testimony that seemed irrefutable. Servants swore they had seen Elspeth meeting with suspicious foreign gentlemen in the park. A shopkeeper claimed she had purchased unusual amounts of expensive paper and sealing wax. Edmund himself had taken the stand, his face a mask of sorrowful disbelief, and testified that his stepsister had always been resentful of her reduced circumstances, bitter about her father's remarriage, and had once mentioned in passing how much he admired France and its revolutionary ideals. Each lie had been delivered with perfect conviction, each false witness carefully coached, and Elspeth had sat in the dock watching her life being dismantled with the precision of a clockmaker taking apart a mechanism. Her court-appointed solicitor had been old and tired, going through the motions without any real belief in her innocence, and when she had tried to speak in her own defense, her voice had sounded thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. The jury had deliberated for less than an hour, guilty of high treason against the crown. The judge had pronounced sentence with grim satisfaction, declaring that she would be taken to the Tower and held there until dawn 3 days hence, at which time she would be executed by beheading, her body to be buried in unmarked ground within the Tower walls, her property and titles forfeited to the crown. The courtroom had erupted in whispers and gasps, and through it all Elspeth had felt herself disappearing, becoming less real with each passing moment, as though she were already a ghost. Her father had not attended the trial. Lady Beatrice had been there, playing her role as the devastated stepmother to perfection, weeping delicately into her handkerchief while Edmund held her hand and looked appropriately grim. No one had spoken for Elspeth. No one had demanded a more thorough investigation. She was nobody, nothing, a girl without consequence, and the machinery of justice had ground her up without hesitation. In the Tower, the days had passed in a blur of cold and darkness and crushing despair. Elspeth had been given the same cell where Anne Boleyn had spent her final nights, a detail the guards had shared with grim amusement, as though the historical irony might entertain her. She had not eaten the food they brought, her stomach too knotted with fear and grief to accept nourishment. She had not slept, her mind too full of racing thoughts and terrible images of what awaited her. Instead, she had paced the small space like a caged animal, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to understand how the world could be so monstrously unfair. And in the darkest hours before dawn, she had finally accepted the truth that no rescue would come, no last-minute pardon would arrive, no hero would break down her door and carry her to safety. She was going to die. And the man who would kill her was Lord Alaric Thornwood, the Duke of Ravenmore, the High Executioner whose name was spoken in whispers throughout the realm. They said he had executed over 50 souls in his 10 years, holding the title from common thieves to noble lords, and that he treated each death with the same cold efficiency. They said he never missed his mark, that his blade fell true every single time, that he took a strange pride in delivering death swiftly and without unnecessary suffering. It was meant to be a mercy, this legendary skill of his, but to Elspeth it felt like just another cruelty, another reminder that she was merely one more name on a long list, utterly forgettable. Lord Alaric Thornwood stood in the armory of his London residence, running a whetstone along the edge of his executioner's axe with practiced, methodical strokes. The sound of steel against stone filled the silence of the room, a rhythm he had performed so many times it had become almost meditative. The weapon was a family heirloom, passed down through 7 generations of Thornwood men who had served as high executioners to the crown, its handle worn smooth by the grip of his ancestors, its blade kept razor-sharp and perfectly balanced. In the morning, he would use it to take the life of Lady Elspeth Grey, a young woman convicted of treason, and the task should have felt no different from any of the dozens of executions he had performed before. But tonight, something gnawed at him, an unfamiliar disquiet that he could not name and did not want to examine. He had seen her only briefly during the trial, a slender figure in a plain grey dress, her face pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap with an almost eerie stillness. She had not wept or pleaded or protested her innocence with theatrical passion. She had simply sat there, accepting her fate with a dignity that seemed incongruous with the crimes she had allegedly committed. Alaric set down the whetstone and lifted the axe, testing its weight, checking the edge with his thumb. Perfect as always. He had learned long ago to separate himself from the humanity of those he executed, to see them not as people with stories and families and dreams, but as tasks to be completed, duties to be fulfilled in service to the crown. It was the only way to survive this burden his bloodline had placed upon him. When he was 25 years old, his father had died, and the title of Duke of Ravenmore had passed to him, along with the hereditary position of High Executioner, a role he had never wanted but could not refuse without bringing dishonor to his family name. In the beginning, the weight of it had nearly destroyed him, the nightmares that came after each execution, the faces of the dead that haunted his sleep. But he had learned to build walls around his heart, to lock away his compassion in a place so deep he could no longer feel it, and over time he had become the man London feared and whispered about, cold as winter ice, unmoved by tears or pleas or desperate last words. But those walls had cracks in them now, fissures that had appeared 6 years ago and never quite healed. His younger sister, Catherine, had been accused of adultery and conspiracy against her husband, a powerful earl with connections to the king. The evidence had been fabricated, the testimony bought and paid for, but Alaric had discovered the truth too late, only after she had already been convicted and sentenced to death. He had gone to the king himself, had thrown himself at the throne and begged for mercy, offering everything he had, his title, his lands, his own life in exchange for hers. But the king had refused, citing the law and the need to maintain order, and Alaric had been forced to watch as another executioner, brought in because he could not be expected to kill his own sister, had taken Catherine's head on a cold March morning. She had been 22 years old, innocent of every charge, and she had died because Alaric had not been powerful enough, or quick enough, or clever enough to save her. That loss had completed his transformation into the man he was now, a man who felt nothing, who executed his duties with mechanical precision, who never allowed himself to question or doubt or hope. He had failed Catherine, and in his failure he had lost the last piece of his humanity, or so he had believed. But tonight, as he prepared to execute Lady Elspeth Grey, that old wound had reopened, bleeding memories he thought he had buried. There was something about the young woman in the tower, something in the way she had carried herself during the trial, that reminded him painfully of his sister. The same quiet dignity, the same acceptance of an unjust fate, the same look in her eyes that said she had already been abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. Alaric shook his head sharply, trying to dislodge the thoughts. It did not matter. His feelings, his memories, his doubts, none of it mattered. Lady Elspeth Grey had been tried and convicted by the king's justice, and his role was not to question, but to execute. At dawn, he would walk into that courtyard. He would raise his axe and he would do what he had been born and bred to do. And afterward, he would lock this uncomfortable feeling away with all the others, and he would continue being the cold, efficient instrument of death that the realm required him to be. There was no other choice. There was never any other choice. But as midnight approached and sleep eluded him, Alaric found himself doing something he had not done in years. He began to question. He sat in his study with a glass of untouched brandy, staring into the fireplace, and allowed himself to think about the trial he had observed. The evidence against Lady Elspeth had been damning, certainly, but it had also been remarkably convenient. Letters found hidden in her personal belongings, testimony from servants who seemed almost too eager to condemn her, witnesses who recited their accounts with the smooth precision of a rehearsed performance. And the young woman herself, sitting silent in the dock, had not looked like a spy or a traitor or a conspirator. She had looked like someone who had already given up, someone who had been crushed by forces beyond her control and had simply stopped fighting. Alaric had seen true criminals face justice before, and they always had a certain quality about them, a defiance or a craftiness or a desperate energy. Lady Elspeth had none of that. She had only looked tired and sad and utterly alone. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out over the dark streets of London. Somewhere across the city, she was sitting in her cell, waiting for dawn, waiting for him to come and end her life. And suddenly, the image of Catherine's face flashed before his eyes, so vivid it made him catch his breath. His sister had worn that same expression in her final days, that same hollow-eyed acceptance, that same quiet surrender to an injustice she could not fight. He had failed Catherine because he had trusted the system, had believed that truth would prevail, had waited too long to act. And by the time he had uncovered the conspiracy against her, by the time he had gathered proof of her innocence, the law had already run its course, and she was dead. He had sworn then that he would never allow himself to feel such helplessness again, that he would never again let emotion cloud his judgment or interfere with his duty. But what if his duty itself was wrong? What if the law, the system he served with such cold precision, was about to make him the instrument of another innocent woman's death? The thought was intolerable. Alaric turned from the window and made a decision that went against every principle he had lived by for the past 6 years. He would investigate. He had hours still before dawn, and he had resources that few men possessed. His title gave him access to records and officials. His reputation gave him authority to ask questions without being questioned in return, and his wealth could loosen tongues that might otherwise remain silent. If Lady Elspeth Grey was truly guilty, then he would proceed with the execution as planned and bury his doubts along with her body. But if there was even a shadow of reasonable doubt, even the faintest possibility that she was innocent, then he would not allow history to repeat itself. He would not fail another young woman the way he had failed Catherine. He rang for his valet and ordered his horse saddled, then dressed quickly in dark, unremarkable clothing that would allow him to move through the city without drawing attention. Within the hour, he was riding through the empty streets, his mind already working through the questions he needed to ask and the people he needed to see. He started with the servants who had testified against Lady Elspeth, tracking them down to the taverns and boarding houses where they lived. Gold coins and thinly veiled threats loosened their tongues quickly enough, and what he heard made his blood run cold. They had been paid, every single one of them, paid handsomely to memorize specific statements and deliver them in court. The money had come from Lady Beatrice Grey, the stepmother, funneled through intermediaries so the transactions could not be easily traced. And the shopkeeper who claimed to have sold Lady Elspeth unusual amounts of paper and sealing wax admitted, after sufficient persuasion, that he had never seen the young woman before in his life, that Lady Beatrice had paid him to lie and had provided him with a detailed description so his testimony would sound credible. By 3 in the morning, Alaric had traced the conspiracy back to its source. Edmund Grey, the stepbrother, was drowning in gambling debts and had been selling military secrets to French contacts for months. When the net had begun to tighten around him, when his activities had drawn the attention of the Crown's investigators, he and his mother had constructed an elaborate frame to shift the blame onto Elspeth. They had planted the evidence, bought the witnesses, and sacrificed her without hesitation to save Edmund's worthless neck. The case against her was a complete fabrication, every piece of it manufactured, and she was going to die in less than 3 hours for crimes her own family had committed. Alaric stood in the street outside Edmund Grey's London townhouse, his hands shaking with a rage so intense it threatened to consume him, and he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. The law had failed Lady Elspeth Grey. The courts had failed her. Her family had betrayed her, but he would not fail her. Not this time. Dawn arrived with cruel beauty, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, as if the heavens themselves were indifferent to the horror about to unfold below. The crowd had begun gathering in the courtyard of the tower before first light, a seething mass of humanity eager for entertainment, for spectacle, for the visceral thrill of watching a noblewoman die. They pressed against the barriers erected by the guards, jostling for position, their voices rising in a cacophony of excitement and bloodlust that made the very air vibrate with ugliness. Vendors moved through the throng selling meat pies and ale, musicians played cheerful tunes, and children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view of the block. This was London's theatre of death, and the audience had come expecting a performance worthy of the price of admission. At the center of it all stood the executioner's platform, raised high enough that even those at the back of the crowd could witness the fatal stroke, and upon it rested the block itself, ancient oak stained almost black with the blood of countless condemned souls. Elspeth was led from her cell by guards who would not meet her eyes, their hands firm but not rough on her arms, as they guided her through the narrow stone corridors and up into the pale morning light. She wore the same white shift they had given her, her hair unbound and falling down her back, as was customary for those about to be executed, her feet bare against the cold cobblestones. The noise of the crowd hit her like a physical force, a wall of sound that seemed to press against her chest and make breathing difficult. She could hear them calling for her blood, could see their faces twisted with excitement and anticipation, and she felt a wave of surreal detachment wash over her, as though she were watching this happen to someone else, some other unfortunate woman who looked like her but could not possibly be her. This could not be real, and yet her feet kept moving forward one step and then another, carrying her inexorably toward the platform and the block and the end of everything. Then she saw him. Lord Alaric Thornwood stood beside the executioner's block, tall and imposing in his formal black attire, his face an unreadable mask beneath the hood that tradition required him to wear. In his hands he held the axe, that terrible instrument of death, its blade catching the early morning light and throwing it back in cruel flashes. Elspeth's legs nearly gave way beneath her, but the guards steadied her, and she forced herself to keep walking, to maintain the dignity that was all she had left. She would not stumble, she would not weep. She would not give the crowd or her executioner or the faceless machinery of injustice the satisfaction of seeing her break. If she was to die, she would die with her head held high, and perhaps someday, somehow, someone would learn the truth and speak her name with pity instead of contempt. The guards led her up the steps to the platform, and the crowd's noise reached a fever pitch, a roar of voices that seemed to shake the very stones of the tower. Elspeth stood before the block, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and she looked at Lord Thornwood for the first time with clear eyes. She expected to see coldness there, the legendary indifference that everyone spoke of, but what she saw instead confused her. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, and his eyes, those winter storm eyes, were not empty at all. They were burning with something that looked almost like fury, almost like anguish, and they were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the space of the platform, executioner and condemned, and Elspeth felt something shift in the air between them, some current of understanding or recognition that she could not name. Then Lord Thornwood moved, but he did not raise the axe to strike. Instead, in a motion so sudden and shocking that it froze the crowd into momentary silence, he lifted the great weapon high above his head with both hands and brought it down with tremendous force, not upon Elspeth's neck, but upon the edge of the executioner's block itself. The axe blade struck the ancient oak with a crack like thunder, and the handle shattered into splinters, the blade embedding itself deep in the wood and breaking free from its shaft. The crowd gasped in collective disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed, and Lord Thornwood let the broken remnants of the axe fall from his hands as he turned to face them all, his voice ringing out across the courtyard with the authority of a man who had never been defied and would not be defied now. He declared her innocent, not in whispered words or private counsel, but in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtyard, To every ear in that bloodthirsty crowd, Lord Alaric Thornwood, Duke of Ravenmore and High Executioner of the realm, proclaimed that Lady Elspeth Grey was the victim of a conspiracy, that she had been falsely accused and wrongfully convicted, and that he would not be the instrument of her murder. The words fell upon the assembly like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and confusion spreading outward in ever-widening circles. The crowd, so loud and eager moments before, stood frozen in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Never in the long history of the Tower had an executioner refused his duty. Never had anyone dared to challenge a sentence handed down by the King's justice. And yet here stood the most feared man in England, the cold and merciless Duke of Ravenmore, openly defying the law and declaring his allegiance not to the Crown's verdict, but to the truth. Alaric continued speaking, his words precise and devastating, laying out the evidence he had uncovered during the night. He named names, detailed the payments made to false witnesses, described the conspiracy orchestrated by Lady Beatrice Grey and her son Edmund to protect themselves by sacrificing an innocent woman. He produced documents he had obtained, signed confessions from servants who had been paid to lie, bank records showing the flow of money from the Grey family coffers to the pockets of those who had testified against Elspeth. His voice never wavered, never softened, and the authority in it was absolute. He was not asking for mercy or pleading for reconsideration. He was stating facts, presenting evidence, and demanding justice with the full weight of his title and reputation behind every word. And the crowd, fickle as all mobs are, began to shift and murmur, their bloodlust transforming into uncertainty, and then into a growing sense that perhaps they had been wrong, that perhaps the real villains were not standing on the platform, but hiding somewhere in London's grand houses. The Tower's governor, a stout man with a florid face, had climbed onto the platform during Alaric's speech, his own face pale with panic and confusion. He attempted to interrupt, to assert his authority and demand that the execution proceed according to the sentence, but Alaric silenced him with a single look, a gaze so cold and commanding that the governor actually took a step backward. Then Alaric did something even more shocking than breaking his axe. He removed his executioner's hood and cast it to the ground, a symbolic gesture that everyone present understood. He was renouncing his hereditary duty, abandoning the position that had defined his family for generations, choosing principle over tradition and conscience over law. And then he turned to Elspeth, who stood trembling beside the block, and he spoke directly to her for the first time, his voice dropping to a tone that only she could hear clearly, though the crowd strained to catch his words. He told her to run. Not literally, not in that moment with hundreds of eyes watching, but he meant it in every way that mattered. He told her that he would hold the authorities at bay, that he would use his position and his power to demand a new investigation, that he would go to the king himself if necessary, and lay the evidence before the throne. He told her that she would not die today, not by his hand or anyone else's, and that he would stake everything he had, his title, his lands, his very life, on proving her innocence to the world. And as he spoke, Elspeth saw in his eyes the ghost of some old pain, some ancient grief that mirrored her own, and she understood that this was not just about her, that she represented something more to him, perhaps a chance at redemption for some past failure she knew nothing about. Tears spilled down her cheeks then, not tears of fear, but tears of overwhelming relief and gratitude and disbelief that someone finally had chosen to see her, to believe in her, to fight for her when everyone else had turned away. The Tower erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, unsure whether to arrest Alaric or protect him, while the crowd surged against the barriers, some shouting support for the Duke's bold stand, and others crying out for the execution to proceed as sentenced. Messages were sent racing to the palace, riders galloping through the streets to inform the king of the unprecedented crisis unfolding at the Tower. And through it all, Alaric stood firm on the platform, positioned between Elspeth and anyone who might try to harm her, his broken axe lying in splinters at his feet, his reputation and his future balanced on the edge of a blade far sharper than any weapon he had ever wielded. He had made his choice, and there would be no turning back from it now. The king's response came swiftly, as Alaric had known it would. Within 2 hours of the broken axe and the public declaration, a royal carriage arrived at the Tower, bearing the Lord Chancellor and a contingent of the king's personal guard. The courtyard, still thick with spectators who refused to leave despite the guards' attempts to disperse them, fell silent once more as the Lord Chancellor emerged from the carriage, his face grave and his bearing rigid with formal authority. He mounted the platform where Alaric still stood guard over Elspeth, and for a long moment the two men faced each other, the Lord Chancellor representing the weight of law and tradition, and Alaric representing something more dangerous and unpredictable, the conscience of a man who had finally chosen to act on his convictions, regardless of the cost. The Lord Chancellor carried a sealed letter bearing the king's own mark, and when he broke the seal and read its contents aloud, his voice carried across the courtyard with ceremonial gravity that made every word feel heavy as iron. The king, in his wisdom and mercy, had ordered an immediate stay of execution pending a full investigation into the Duke of Ravenmore's allegations. Lady Elspeth Grey would be remanded to custody not in the Tower, but in the Duke's own household, under his personal supervision and guarantee, until such time as the truth could be established beyond any doubt. Furthermore, Edmund Grey and Lady Beatrice Grey were to be arrested immediately and brought before the King's Court to answer charges of conspiracy, perjury, and treason. The Lord Chancellor's voice trembled slightly as he read this last part, and well it might, for the implications were staggering. The king was not merely granting Alaric's request for a new investigation. He was publicly validating the Duke's actions, acknowledging that the original trial might have been compromised, and setting in motion a process that could expose corruption at the highest levels of society. It was an earthquake, and the aftershocks would be felt throughout London for months to come. Elspeth listened to these words as if from a great distance, her mind still struggling to accept that she was not going to die, that the nightmare was not ending with her head on the block, but with something she had never dared to imagine, the possibility of vindication. The guards who had led her to the platform now led her away from it, but this time their grip was gentle, almost respectful, and they brought her not back to the cold darkness of her cell, but to a waiting carriage bearing the Thornwood family crest. Alaric followed, his presence commanding even in the wake of his dramatic defiance, and he handed her into the carriage himself with a courtesy that seemed jarring after everything that had just transpired. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask him why he had risked everything for a stranger, but her voice had abandoned her completely, and all she could do was look at him with eyes that held 1,000 unspoken questions. The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Alaric had already done much of the work during his midnight hunt for truth, but now the full machinery of the King's justice turned its attention to the Grey family, and what it uncovered was damning beyond measure. Edmund Grey, when confronted with the evidence and the testimony of witnesses who could no longer be bought or intimidated, confessed to everything. He detailed his gambling debts, his contact with French agents, his sale of military secrets, and his mother's plan to frame Elspeth as the scapegoat. Lady Beatrice, faced with her son's confession and the mountain of evidence against them both, attempted to flee London but was captured before she reached the coast. The trials were swift, the verdicts unanimous, and the sentences harsh. Edmund was hanged as a traitor, his body left to rot in a gibbet as a warning to others who might consider selling England's secrets. Lady Beatrice, as a woman of noble birth, was spared the gallows, but sentenced to life imprisonment in conditions far harsher than the cell where Elspeth had awaited her own death. And through it all, Elspeth remained in Alaric's household, a strange and awkward arrangement that set London society buzzing with speculation and scandal. She was housed in a suite of rooms in the east wing of Thornwood Manor, attended by servants who treated her with cautious respect, and she saw the Duke himself only occasionally, usually at carefully chaperoned dinners where they spoke of nothing consequential and avoided the weight of what had passed between them on the executioner's platform. But she felt his presence constantly, like a shield between her and the world, and she knew that he was working tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure not just her exoneration, but her complete restoration. He wanted more than her innocence proven. He wanted her honor returned, her name cleared, her place in society acknowledged. And as the days turned into weeks, Elspeth began to understand that Lord Alaric Thornwood was a man driven by demons she could only guess at, a man seeking redemption for sins she did not know, and that somehow saving her had become his path to salvation. The night before the formal announcement of her complete exoneration, Alaric came to Elspeth's sitting room unannounced, his usual composure fractured by something raw and urgent. She had been reading by the fire, trying to lose herself in words that were not about trials or treason or death, when he knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. He looked different somehow, less the cold and distant duke, and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy for one soul to bear alone. He dismissed her maid with a gesture and closed the door behind him, a breach of propriety that would have scandalized anyone who witnessed it. But Elspeth found she did not care about propriety anymore, not after everything they had been through together. He stood before the fire, his back to her for a long moment, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored coat. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he had clearly been holding back for far too long. He told her about Catherine, about his sister, who had been innocent, who had been falsely accused and executed before he could save her, who had died while he stood helpless and broken, unable to wield the power he possessed quickly enough to make a difference. He told her how Catherine's face had haunted him every day since, how he had built walls around his heart and turned himself into a machine, because feeling anything at all was too painful to endure. He told her that he had performed 53 executions in the years following his sister's death, and that with each one he had told himself he was serving justice, serving the law, serving something larger than his own guilt and grief. But the truth, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words, was that he had been running from himself, hiding behind duty and tradition, because facing his own failure would have destroyed him completely. And then he had seen Elspeth standing in that courtroom, quiet and dignified and utterly alone, and it had been like watching Catherine die all over again. He turned to face her then, and Elspeth saw tears on his cheeks, the first genuine emotion she had ever witnessed from the man London called heartless and cold. He told her that breaking his axe had been the easiest decision he had ever made, that choosing to fight for her had felt like finally, after 6 years of penance and self-imposed exile from his own humanity, doing something right. He told her that she had saved him as much as he had saved her, that giving him a second chance to act with honor and courage had given him back a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. And then, with a vulnerability that took her breath away, he asked her forgiveness for all the condemned souls he had not questioned, for all the times he had simply followed orders without looking deeper, for being the instrument of a justice system that was sometimes anything but just. He did not deserve her forgiveness, he said, but he asked for it anyway, because she was the only person in the world who might understand what it meant to be judged unfairly, to be condemned by appearances, to be crushed beneath the weight of other people's cruelty. Elspeth rose from her chair and crossed to him, her own tears flowing freely now, and she took his hands in hers, those hands that had held the axe that was meant to kill her, those hands that had broken that axe and changed both their fates forever. She told him there was nothing to forgive, that he had acted with the information he had, that he could not have known the truth about all those who had come before her. But more than that, she told him that he had given her something far more precious than life itself. He had given her worth. He had looked at her, a woman society had discarded as worthless and forgettable, and he had decided she mattered enough to risk everything for. He had seen value in her when her own family had seen only convenience, had believed in her innocence when the entire machinery of justice had pronounced her guilty. And in doing so, he had taught her something she had never truly understood before, that her value did not depend on other people's recognition, that she had always been worthy, even when no one was looking, even when no one cared. They stood together before the fire, holding hands like children lost in a dark forest who had finally found each other, and for the first time since his sister's death, Alaric felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw, and for the first time since her arrest, Elspeth felt something other than fear and despair. She felt hope. She felt seen. And beneath it all, growing slowly but undeniably, she felt the first tender stirrings of something that might, given time and courage, become love. Not the dramatic, sweeping passion of novels, but something quieter and deeper, built on shared trauma and mutual understanding, and the recognition that they had both been broken by the world and had somehow found a way to make each other whole again, The formal exoneration came 3 weeks later, proclaimed from the steps of the royal courts of justice, before a crowd even larger than the one that had gathered to watch Elspeth die. The Lord Chancellor read the decree in a voice that carried across the square, declaring that Lady Elspeth Grey had been proven innocent of all charges, that she had been the victim of a heinous conspiracy, and that her name and honour were hereby fully restored by order of His Majesty the King. The crowd erupted in cheers, the same fickle mob that had jeered at her now celebrating her vindication with equal enthusiasm, and Elspeth stood on those steps feeling the sunlight on her face and thinking how strange it was that the world could change so completely in such a short time. But the truly shocking moment came not with the official proclamation, but with what followed it. Lord Alaric Thornwood, standing beside her in his formal ducal regalia, turned to face her before all those assembled witnesses, and he did something that sent gasps rippling through the crowd and set London society ablaze with scandal and delight. He knelt before her. The Duke of Ravenmore, one of the most powerful men in England, the feared high executioner who had renounced his hereditary duty for her sake, lowered himself to one knee on the stone steps and took her hand in his. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and firm and loud enough for everyone to hear, and he asked her to marry him. Not in private, not with whispered words and careful planning, but here now in this most public of forums, before the lords and ladies and common folk of London, before the very society that had condemned her and now witnessed her triumph. He told her that she had awakened his heart from a long winter, that she had reminded him what it meant to fight for something beyond duty and tradition, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving to her that she was valued and cherished and loved beyond measure. He offered her not just his hand, but his name, his title, his fortune, and his protection for all the days they had remaining. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for her answer, and Elspeth looked down at this complicated, damaged, extraordinary man who had saved her life and then opened his soul to her, and she felt her own heart swell with a certainty she had never experienced before. She said yes. She said it loudly and clearly, with no hesitation and no doubt, and the crowd erupted once more, this time in genuine joy and celebration. The wedding took place a month later in Westminster Abbey, attended by half of London society, and blessed by the King himself, who had taken a particular interest in this unlikely romance that had grown from the ashes of injustice and tragedy. Elspeth walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, no longer the invisible, discarded daughter of a bankrupt earl, but the bride of a duke, elevated to one of the highest positions in the realm, transformed from condemned prisoner to Duchess of Ravenmore in a reversal of fortune so dramatic it would be told and retold in drawing rooms and taverns for years to come. Their life together was not perfect, for they were both too scarred by their pasts to achieve any fairy tale ideal, but it was real and honest, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that deepened into genuine love as the years passed. Alaric never returned to his role as executioner, choosing instead to use his position and influence to reform the justice system that had failed both his sister and his wife. He became an advocate for the accused, a voice demanding thorough investigations and fair trials, and his presence in the courts was a constant reminder that the law must serve justice, not merely tradition. Elspeth, for her part, became a duchess unlike any London had seen before, using her own experience to champion the forgotten and the powerless, establishing charities for women without family protection and legal funds for those who could not afford proper defense. Together they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and they raised them with the knowledge that rank and privilege were not measures of worth, that true nobility came from character and courage, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was choosing to see value in someone the world had overlooked. And so, dear listener, the woman who was sentenced to die at dawn became instead the duchess who changed the law, and the executioner who broke his axe became the man who broke the cycle of blind obedience to unjust authority. Their story reminds us that our worth is not determined by how others see us, that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose differently, and that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply refusing to accept the role that cruelty and injustice have assigned to us. In your own life, when you feel invisible or undervalued, when the world seems determined to define you by your lowest moment, or your greatest vulnerability, remember Lady Elspeth Grey. Remember that your value exists independent of recognition. That vindication may come from unexpected sources, and that the courage to stand firm in your own worth can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. You are seen, you matter. And your story, like Elspeth's, is not over until you decide how it ends.